Research Roundtable, Discussions with New Researchers, Episode 2. Research Roundtable is a segmented overview of issues faced by new researchers from their own perspective.
This is Dave Donnelly presenting an overview of shifting research paradigms, Part 1, from quantity to quality to virtual. The purpose of this presentation is to give an overview of research as it has transitioned away from quantitative methods towards qualitative methods, and then the continued shift from qualitative methods as they extend to performing studies online. In order to discuss shifting paradigms, it's important to talk about the existing circumstances that influence research. Trustworthiness and rigor is a big part of how research is evaluated for quality. Trustworthiness in an academic context generally refers to confidence in one's data, the validity of a study and the reliability of the study, that the study is objective, ensuring that there is veracity and rigor in one's methods, using valid sources, ensuring credibility and transferability to other contexts, and the overall quality of the study and its data collection methods. There are certain aspects that would generally cause researchers and peers to consider a piece of literature or study to be untrustworthy. Generally, this will come in, but be not limited to, conflicting data, unreliable, conflicting, or untrustworthy sources and source and secondary material, poor validity, whether it is internal or external, a small sample size with no explanation for how those results can or should be generalized, and a lack of transparency. These traditional criteria of trustworthiness have grown as research has grown. So generally, they've been traditionally applied to quantitative research, as that's been the MO for since the advent of research and the change to qualitative or the addition of qualitative research. So these traditional criteria are generally referred to as internal and external validity, reliability, and objectivity. So internal being, do your results show a cause and effect within your study? External meaning, are they generalizable? Reliability meaning, do you get the same results if you conduct the experiment or study in the same way every time? And are the results unbiased and true to life? These traditional criteria may be problematic or inapplicable to qualitative studies, especially as they move online. Some of these problems could include a difficulty to replicate them, especially online. So there is a difficulty in achieving validity. The results may be difficult to generalize, especially if there's not a lot of data on the setting, participants, or context. A difficulty with quantifying human data and experiences. Applicability versus generalizability and how those two things work in tandem together and against each other. And questioning if the findings are reliant on circumstance or not. Qualitative study has grown roughly over the last 30 to 40 years, and qualitative studies today are generally required to be built in and rooted in learning theory to give their methods and their studies rigor and generalizability. A big part of this is building rapport with participants and showing transparency, as well as looking at the reflexivity, self-reflection, and positionality of the researcher themselves as an instrument. These new paradigms include prolonged engagement and persistent observation, triangulating your data, engaging in peer review and debriefing, so not only peer review at the journal or submission stage, but within the context of the study and during the study itself, looking at negative case analyses, clarifying researcher bias, which there always is, so it's important to pay attention to that, checking in with the members of the study as well as those who are conducting it, engaging in thick description and external audits from individuals who are outside involvement of the study. Now that we've discussed the terms and criteria generally used to judge traditional research, we're going to talk about how to move away from these so-called scientific terms as they apply more readily to qualitative data collection and online data collection. So in part 2, we will be looking at how internal validity becomes credibility, how external validity becomes transferability, how reliability becomes dependability, and objectivity becomes confirmability. This is Dave Donnelly. Stay tuned for part 2. Thank you.
So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. The three of us are here, Allison, myself, and Daniel, and what we'll be talking about is the need for equity and research. And now equity is an interesting concept because we hear a lot about equality, we hear a lot about justice, and equity is an integral piece of both of those things. Because what equity looks at is addressing oppression and marginalization to help elevate and lift up others so that they are on the same plane and have the same level of opportunity to succeed, that folks who may not be facing the same level of oppression and marginalization due to various different intersecting identities that they have. Now, one of the specifically interesting things that we're going to be looking at is how equity ties into our individual research focuses, because often, historically speaking, in academia, there's been a denial, so to speak, of equity. For example, if you look at, if you look at the historical underpinnings of IQ testing, those were typically normed on upper and upper middle class white children and white people. And so while we're thinking about these implications for equity and research, we need to be looking at how we're making a concerted effort to be inclusive of typically marginalized populations in how we conduct our research. So that's the main focus today. So our hope is that as we kind of just engage with how we're going to be knitting equity into our research, it can also give you, as the listener, some insight into how you can be cognizant of that if you're a researcher, even if you're just, somebody who may not be in academia, but, if you're looking online you're trying to find, trying to explore things, it's about getting alternate perspectives. I hesitate to say alternate. It's about getting expansive perspectives. That's a better way to put it. And giving yourself the ability to recognize filters and lenses you may have as assumptions. So that's why we want to talk about this today. So as we're moving forward, we'll be, the three of us will be talking about how, like I said, how these things apply specifically for us, but it'll also, I'm sure it'll expand into various other pieces of the conversation and experiences, we've all had as well and seen, and so we'll go from there. So the three of us are here. I'd like to introduce Allison Ricketts first. Allison's pursuing her doctorate of education. She's a doctoral candidate involved in leadership in education. She's been a teacher in the past. And Allison, why don't I let you introduce yourself a little bit as well?
Yeah, I'm really excited to be talking about this topic with both of you today. So I was a teacher in Appalachian, Ohio for 14 years, and then I went to work for a nonprofit called Building Bridges to Careers, where we provide experiential learning opportunities to students all across southeastern Ohio. And so we're very involved in connecting students to their local communities and providing opportunities for students to learn about careers and potentials for their futures, here in Appalachia or elsewhere. So really excited about the work that we're doing. We're talking about the opportunity gap. We're talking about social capital building. We're talking about all of these things in the work that I'm doing and in the research that we do at Building Bridges to Careers. So this is, super, super timely on so many levels, especially as we're coming out of COVID-19 in a rural area where access has not been equitable, or in many cases exacerbated existing inequalities. So it's great to be here with all of you.
Yeah. I got excited just listening to you describe those things. Now I want to talk to you. Now I just want to pick your brain more about it too. So thank you for that, Allison. Daniel, I want to introduce you as well. Daniel is a doctoral candidate getting his PhD in counselor education and supervision. And I know Daniel's done a lot of research specifically in counselor supervision and representation in counselor supervision. That's the word that was escaping me. Daniel, why don't you take it away and introduce yourself a little bit?
All right. Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. I think this is an interesting topic and a very relevant one that we get to discuss. And first of all, like you mentioned, my name is Daniel Ampabin. I'm from Ghana. I did my undergraduate program in Ghana in psychology and adult education. Came back to the US in 2017 to do my master's in the counseling program, and after my master's, pursuing my PhD in the counseling program. And I've done, some studies. I've done some studies in the area of supervision and mentoring. And recently, I'm working with adolescents who are legally mandated, to seek services when it comes to, drug addiction. So substance use adolescent in a residential facility. And most of these individuals are court mandated. So they feel like they are being, coerced and forced into treatment. So there is usually when they're working with a clinician, there's not so much of what is the word? Therapeutic alliance between them. So that is what I'm working on right now, trying to see how these clinicians are able to develop, the alliance, build the alliance between themselves and this client who feel like they are being coerced into treatment. Because, the therapeutic alliance, as according to research, is one of the most useful ingredient or element that needs to happen in a session between a client and a therapist in order for us to have a successful counseling service. So that is what I'm working on currently. And I think there are a lot of things that we can look at with regards to equity, as in the topic in question right now, that we can also explore further in this area. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm very happy to join you guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. I'm happy you're here as well. I think it's a very interesting intersection that you're working in, because you're working with the supervision piece, but you're also working with clientele who don't want to be there, and often those clientele have overlapping marginalized or oppressed identities, whether it be
Right.
poverty or whether it be race or ethnicity or things like that. So
Right.
But yeah, so thank you for being here. Insofar as myself, my name's Brandon Tomlinson. I'm a doctoral candidate. I got to get used to that. In counselor education and supervision as well. So my two focus areas have been in counselor professional identity is the first one. And what I mean by that is how the counselor, how a clinical mental health, how a school counselor, how a clinical rehabilitation counselor defines themselves in a professional setting. And what I have found is that it is important to knit together the justice aspect of our counseling focus, because social justice is one of the main points, essentially, of counseling ethics, and ensuring that that's a prominent feature, because if that is not a prominent feature, counselors can't successfully advocate for clients and be present for clients and take into account the importance of understanding a client's perspective based on whatever intersecting identities they may have. And I've found that piece is underemphasized. And so that's one thing I've been taking great steps to emphasize in my research thus far. An additional interesting piece is how counselor educators, how people who teach counselors to be counselors, inform those counseling students about values and ethics. Because, for example, I would contend, and the literature would back me up on this, that it's not possible to be a counselor and be homophobic, or it's not possible to be a counselor and be racist. Those values simply do not comport with the counseling process. And so how do we identify people with those values in the counseling education setting? So that's my current research area. And so that's why I'm also very interested in discussing equity specifically, because those center around equity in counseling.
Right.
So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I'm so super excited to dive right into these questions. So I'm just going to throw the first one out. And Brandon, you did a little bit of this at the beginning, but I think it's important that we talk about what exactly we mean when we say equity. Like, what is equity, and where have you come across equity in your fields of research?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I can jump in, Daniel, and if you don't want, I didn't want to step on anyone's toes.
No, you can go ahead.
Good. Yeah, that's the counselor in me. I'm very. I like to make sure anybody who wants to talk can. So forgive me for that. But yeah, so within my context, is again of the not even just the research I've been doing, but just the field more generally. I find that I'm both encouraged by a lot of the counselor focus on justice, and specifically equity within justice, of making sure we're accounting for intersecting identities and making space for those who have been typically oppressed and marginalized. What I will add is that there's a lot of growth left to do in my field specifically, just because, again, a lot of what counseling uses is borrowed from early social work and early psychology, both fields which have problematic histories, we'll say. Like, I'll admit, it's credit where it's due. Social workers have done an excellent job of rehabilitating that penchant for, isolating or oppressing. They've done a really nice job with that. And psychology is starting to as well. And so is counseling. But our DNA is kind of drawn a little bit from those fields. And so I see the gap essentially where, we are focused on theories that were mostly developed by old dead white dudes who really didn't have a lot of thought processes given to, oh, how does this impact a trans kid living in a lower middle class socioeconomic situation or things like that. It's more of a, oh, well, these are all developed in, the early part of the century with, the underpinnings of academia and affluence and all of these things. And so I think we're doing a good job starting to pull those apart, but I'd be lying if I said that I don't see a lot of gaps still, which is why I like to focus on this specifically. How do we teach counselors inclusive values? So
I read something really interesting in the Stanford Social Innovation Review that said that equity is not diversity, inclusion, or equality. It's something separate from those concepts and describes something deeper and more complex, which I think is sort of what, you're getting at, Brandon, is that equity is something that looks backward over historical contexts. It looks deeply into present social, political identity constructs, and understands that the whole of a person, in providing access to opportunities or providing an equitable, I don't know, even reach, has to be considered in order for equity to be achieved.
yes.
So I really liked that because, and I think this goes back to, what we were talking about earlier, is that in educational leadership, as well as counseling education, it's been traditional for the leader to have a very hard cleft between personal opinions and professional identity. And I hear you arguing, and I see in my own research in educational leadership, this idea that if leaders are really going to work for equity, they have to hold those values and those anti-racist values and those sort of things at the center of their professional identity. And there is no such thing as a separation of personal opinions and this professional identity. You can't be in the world as a professional without knowing that equity and visibility and representation and inclusion and diversity is something necessary. And Daniel, I'm really interested for your perspective on this because I'm a white woman born and raised in the United States, specifically in the Midwest. I was raised evangelical Christian, and although I'm a member of the LGBT community, I can very easily pass for heterosexual. And so, even though there's equity issues in my life, it's definitely not to the extent of some of my colleagues or some of my friends. And I'm just really interested for your international perspective of what even you see going on in the United States and research here.
Yeah, I think you bring a valid point, and thinking through this and thinking about equity. I think one time I was in one of our classes that I was co-teaching in multicultural class. We teaching about discrimination, oppression, and stuff like that. And I had one of the students, kind of like making their argument, and what they were saying is, this is a white individual guy, like a white guy, and he was arguing that they keep talking about privileges, and he doesn't see any privileges that he has because he's coming from a low background, and he feels like he's worked for everything that he has. And so I guess at the end of the day, his argument, he was arguing in the sense of like equality, like he's doing everything he can in his capacity, and everything he has, he's worked for it. So everybody should be given equal platform, even though that is not the case. But I guess what I'm trying to pinpoint is differentiating between sometimes the mistake we make when we're talking about equity. Sometimes we think about equality. So I think equity is more than equality. So just want to throw a light on it, that we don't mistake equity to be like, oh, we all have to have the same point. And I was listening to one person on a podcast, and they made an analogy that I want to say here, which I thought throws more light on equity. So the argument the person made is, suppose as we are human beings, we have our bodies, we treat our bodies equally. If you think about it, you will say your head is important, equal as your hand, and as your legs and stuff. But suppose you break your hands, and your hand is in pain. At that moment, all the attention comes to the hand, and you pay more attention, let's say 90% of your attention and care to the hand, and the 10% on the other part of the body. And that does not mean that the other part of the body is not important. But in that moment, the hand is what is in pain and needs, the care. So in that case, you allocate more resources or more care to help the hand to come to the level as the other part of the body. So when we're talking about equity, we also have to think about, sometimes equity goes beyond equality, and sometimes in order to level the playground, we have to pay much more attention to the people who are privileged, who are oppressed, who are marginalized, far beyond even creating an equal platform. Sometimes we have to even allocate much more resources to help them come at par with the other side. So I think when we bring this in the issue of research, like Brandon had mentioned, I feel like when we're doing research and in our daily lives, thinking about equity, and sometimes we have to be mindful that the people who are marginalized, people who are oppressed and disadvantaged, we might deliberately have to allocate more time, more care, more resources, pay attention to their needs, be open-minded and empathize with them, in order to help them in the way of, let's say, empowering and providing justice and support to them. I don't know if that makes sense.
I love that
Absolutely.
analogy of society as a body, as
Right.
a living, thriving organism that works together. And I love that idea about equity and the work of equity as being care.
Right.
I think that
Yeah.
that is a radical idea, and I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was an interesting concept. So
Yeah. I'm glad you shared that. I agree. I was I was enthralled. It's funny, between the two of you, I've wanted to jump out of my chair and like raw a few times because I really I and I say that because like, it's and it's doubly interesting just because, not doubly interesting, but like, Daniel, you share this example of this white student who was talking about, well, I don't see how I've benefited from any of these things, and it's a perspective that, and I think that that's kind of, it speaks to a few things. It speaks to the blindness that people with privilege, myself notwithstanding, as a
yeah,
white man, and again, I'm also a member of the LGBT community, but like, again, I that's not a parent, right? Like, I could be
right,
passing for a cis hetero man, and being, uh, but being, people with privilege tend to have that blindness because it's not something that they have to think about, right?
exactly.
Like this student hadn't had to think about, like, oh, if I get pulled over by a police officer, because one of my favorite professors of all time, I love her to death. Um, she facilitated a really interesting conversation in my master's program about how about and she was a black woman, and she facilitated a conversation about the talk that
Hmm.
black parents have to have with their kids about
Mhm.
what to do if you're interacting with a police officer. And one of the other students, who was also a black woman, she was an older student, so she had grown grown men children, and she talked about how having that talk, like, how did she put it? It was something to the effect of, if you're white, you don't have to think about having that talk with your kids. You don't have to think about those things. And I think that's what people with privilege miss, is privilege isn't like, yay, everything's great. It's all, rainbows and whatnot
Right,
and ponies, but it is, I don't have to think about the fact that I'm white if I get pulled over by a cop, or
exactly.
I don't have to think about being harassed for being, just being a woman walking down the street, or
Mhm.
being maybe a person who's trans, who's just trying to live their life, but they're also harassed and all of these constant things. So and I think that plays into how academics approach their research too. That privilege just doesn't filter in, and so I
Right.
think, you know, uh, and again, I won't say.
I want to pick up on this point, Brandon, that you
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
said. So, what in research projects that you all have done in the past, or even in past courses, where did this issue of equity come up, or where did you wish it came up?
Mm.
Can I say something if
Yeah,
that
go
is?
go go.
I think one of the things I guess that comes to mind with regards to equity has to do with even language barriers. In doing research, sometimes we don't pay attention to, or probably sometimes we ignore the choice of words, and individuals who might be taking questionnaires, let's for example filling the questionnaires, and their background, English might not be their first language, so we might think some of the words we use probably everybody is supposed to understand, so sometimes we don't pay attention. I guess that is where the importance of doing a pilot study comes in. So this is something that comes to mind, and I've also seen some research studies where they're taking the demographics, and they use the gender binary, like they don't account for individuals who belong to the LGBT community, and such individuals, from the get-go, you're doing a study, you've neglected or marginalized them, you've not accounted for them in their study. So when they fill in such questionnaires, it becomes a challenge for them, like where do they put themselves in the study? So I feel like these are some of the stuff that we have to pay attention to when it comes to equity, that we are accounting for everybody, giving everybody the opportunity to have be able to share, be part of the study, and us not to have skewed results, I guess, Because if somebody does not identify as male or female or whatever, and we've not accounted for that, they might choose not to, ignore it because we didn't account for what they consider themselves to be. So if they choose any of the stuff we've provided, that is a skewed result because we were going to account that at the wrong demographic. So I think these are some of the stuff that in the past I've seen questionnaire studies where they don't account for the LGBT community for how individuals identify themselves. And sometimes the language where it becomes ambiguous or difficult for individuals who don't, English is not their first language, to understand some of the questions or how some of the questions are framed, so that is what comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a good example, Daniel. I was just gonna, it was interesting you asked. I have a very specific example of, so I was doing a presentation in a class once, and I was talking it over prior to giving the presentation with the professor, and it was interesting, Daniel, because it was about assessments and things like that. So it was about the language I wanted to use while I was giving this presentation was, yeah, this assessment is not entirely valid because it's normed on traditionally white supremacist values. I wanted to use the word white supremacist, or the phrase white supremacist. And the professor stopped me and said, I don't think you should do that because there's one particular student who I know will get on a long diatribe and distract the class. And there was a part of me that was very disappointed, frankly, because if you're missing a teachable moment, not just for that student, because I don't know that somebody who's that entrenched is going to be divertable, to make up a word, from that particular, covertly or overtly racist viewpoint. But B, standing up for that and making that point in the class to all those other students who are in a very receptive format. They were youngins, they were early baby master students, right? So they're going to be very receptive to those things. And so if we can put those, if I was able to put that in front of them and say, listen, it's a type of IQ test. It's called the WACE-4, and and as useful as it can be, it's also biased toward upper middle class white people, which I mentioned briefly earlier. And I wanted to use that word, white supremacist, because it's valid. It's what that test is normed on. It's based around that, unintentionally, but nonetheless. And I was disappointed that I was encouraged not to go down that road because they were afraid of having this conflict. And it almost brings me back to that point, Allison, that you made about that cleft between the personal and the academic. And the fact that I agree with you wholeheartedly. I don't think that cleft can exist. I think by choosing to force it to exist, it just empowers oppression is all it does.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it's a fine line for us as students who are also emerging into our own identities as researchers and theorists and practitioners. It's a fine line for us to walk between criticizing and taking action against our professors, or that would go against what our professors would like, and it's simply being an expression of what we believe to be best practice or the most ethical practice. I have a really similar situation, Brandon, where professors that I respected and admire, the syllabus was just devoid of any sort of representation from any theorist that was not white and male, because that's what's traditional. That's traditional thought in our educational leadership discipline. It's been dominated by white males, and it's just simply time for that to change. And I was likewise disappointed that I would bring it up, or I would put it on surveys, or I would put it in my class evaluations, and nothing would change. And so then I think that we're left with being the change that we want to see in the world.
Right.
And again, I just want to come back to that idea, Daniel, that you had about the work of equity being care and not being something that we're doing to be PC, or we're adhering to a new initiative passed down from the dean. That's not what this is. This is care for our fellow human beings, for our fellow students, for our colleagues, for our professors, for the wider world.
Right.
And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing
Mhm.
when we're engaging in this work.
Yeah. And yet again, I want to jump out of my chair.
I know,
But
it's so important, right?
it is. It is. It, it's we're it's not an unwinnable battle, but I do feel and I hesitate to say battle. I don't like combative terms, but it's not an unwinnable process. But it does feel, it is disappointing to see how entrenched it still is,
Mhm.
and uh, to have to try and have that dance where, and it denies the fact. And I think this is something that's hopefully growing. I've seen it more present, and I wish I could attribute properly, but I can't remember where it comes from. The concept of the personal is the political. I was chatting with a friend about that recently, and when I say political, I know that can sound charged, but what I mean is
Second
like,
wave feminism, Brandon.
I know, and I that's why I felt bad. Like I can't remember which person, like which group of people really conceptualized that. I was talking with you both know Gene. For the listeners, Gene is another doctoral student. They're a good friend of mine, and we were talking about how that's important. And it feels so integrated to this concept of equity, building equity, and integrating that into the justice work that we do. Because if again, it goes back to what we were all kind of touching on earlier. If you deny those things, if you try and have it be this sanitized, academic, completely devoid of interpersonal identity or intersectional social identity, that's not possible, and therefore empowers harmful paradigms.
Right.
So let's talk specifically about dissertation work and how we're each going to address issues of equity in the dissertation work, whether that's through methodology, whether that's through transparency and reporting, wherever, or if you're specifically, talking about equity in your dissertation. I just love to hear how you're thinking about integrating this idea of equity throughout your dissertation. Daniel, you want to kick us off?
Okay, I can go ahead. So with dissertation, I guess in order for it to make sense, let me touch on the topic that I'm doing, or I guess I've not, I'm working on, presenting as my proposal. Hopefully it get accepted and I proceed with it. So like I mentioned, I do some work with adolescents who have substance use disorder. And these are adolescents in a residential facility, and most of them, majority of them are court mandated, to come into the facility for treatment for the substance use. And according to the studies, they are actually conflicting results when it comes to, working alliance between legally mandated client and the therapist. There have been some studies that shows that there's kind of conflict. The participant or the client feel like the therapists are working with the legal system, because when you are a therapist, especially with this adolescent, you work with their probation officers, you work with the court systems. So you are kind of part of the system that brought them to the residential facility. And there is this perception that sometimes they feel like they've been coerced and forced into the treatment. They didn't come there willingly. So right from the beginning of sessions, there's this, struggle and conflict between the adolescent or the client and the therapist. There's no effective working alliance between them. So, and according to research, studies have shown that working alliance is very important when it comes to a successful counseling sessions, because the client and the therapist have to be on the same page. They have to agree on the goals that they want to achieve. So it's a teamwork, and until the client comes to the point where they realize that change is necessary for them and change is valuable to them, change will never happen. So if there's no collaboration and they feel like they are being coerced and there's no working alliance, then there is a higher possibility we will go nowhere. So that is what I want to explore and do my dissertation, and then work on the therapists on how they are able to build this effective working alliance between them and these adolescents who perceive that they are being coerced into the system, they are being coerced into treatment. So how do you work with such individuals? So that is what I want to do, to explore the therapists, the techniques and procedures that they use to build this working alliance. And thinking in terms of, equity, I was talking to yesterday with a friend about, this work that I want to do, and they raised an issue about, okay, have you thought about also exploring the perspective and, the perception of the client in this situation? Because I was thinking of just, exploring with the therapist. And thinking about equity, you think about it, then a part of it feels right to also kind of explore from the, the adolescent perspective, how do they really perceive their, the service they're getting in the residential facility? How do they think, what are some things that they feel like the counselors are able to do that helps them to build that working alliance between them? So I guess in terms of thinking about equity and care and inclusiveness, then I'm thinking of probably also exploring the perception and ideas of the the client, and not only the therapist in this case. So trying to incorporate them, probably get the perception and ideas from both the therapist and the client. It's one way I'm thinking in terms of equity. And I'm also thinking of, I feel like in a nutshell, at the end of the studies, this study is going to help us to throw more light on how clinicians can work with legally mandated adolescent, possibly can be, transfer of knowledge even to adults in the case of legally mandated individuals. Because I read a study that they even spoke about how some therapists have negative perceptions about individuals coming from the, prison systems. They have negative perceptions about them, like they've been incarcerated and all that stuff. So probably these studies also would throw more light on how clinicians should be able to empathize and understand these individuals. And majority from my work that I've realized, majority of these individuals have experienced, serious traumatic event, and their way of coping with this is, resorting to substance use. And that is what, lead them to detention and these legal systems, and they are being referred to there. So if you think about it, if you are able to meet them where they are and not judge them, and explore with them what is accounting for their use of drugs. It could be, the trauma that they've experienced in the past. And the only way they can deal with this trauma is to use drugs, So having that mindset and not neglecting or having negative perception from the get-go when working with them would, I guess, would also throw some light on how we will be mindful about any biases and prejudices that we might have against individuals who are coming from, the court system, individuals who are using substance, and not kind of prejudge them like, oh, this is an addict and they have nothing to offer, so to speak. So these are some of the things I'm also thinking about in case of, in light of equity, to pay attention to, making sure everyone's voice is being heard, throwing more light on some of the prejudices and biases that clinicians might even hold when they're working with individuals who are legally mandated or coming from the court system, or individuals who are using substance, throwing more light on, some biases and being mindful of making sure that it's not interfering with how we work with them.
I think that something you said was something that I found also when, kind of like looking at equity and guidelines on equity for researchers. And I found an article from the that talks about sex and gender equity in research guidelines. Mm-hmm. And one of the very first things that this article talks about is the necessity for researchers to examine their own biases,
right,
and their own approaches to the world, and how that informs inequity. So I think that that's a really, really, really necessary part of what's happening in probably all of our research.
Right. Right. And I think you even mentioning researchers, of course, that brings to mind the fact that myself personally, as a researcher, also being mindful of any biases that I might have, which might influence even the way that I put my questions to this, therapist and the client when doing the interviews, because the questions I'm going to put out is coming from probably my understanding and perceptions. So being mindful of my own biases and prejudices that might also influence how I interact with, the participants is something that I also have to be mindful of.
So Daniel, do you think you'll write about that or that question selection process and your mindfulness in your dissertation? Will that be something that you report about?
I think it will be very, important to report that, throw more light about this, perceptions and, working on how that was catered for, how, that was paid attention to in a way that is not influencing the study in any way. So I think that is something that I have to work on and put in the studies for sure.
That's something that I've started looking for in empirical research when I'm doing literature reviews and the like. I've started looking to see if there's any mention of the researcher's identity or acknowledge of bias or acknowledgement of limitations of the research study because they only were able to survey this demographic of individuals, or
Right.
it's skewed male or it's skewed female, or they didn't include any other gender. And so that's something that I've become more accustomed to looking for while we're waiting for the research community to develop universal guidelines on equity and writing research.
Right.
So I think it's really encouraging that we're thinking about that and that will be worked into our work as a
Exactly.
matter of personal choice.
Right.
Brandon, do you wanna go ahead?
Yeah, I was gonna say I want to talk about in my dissertation work too, but it's also interesting because I wanted to address that point that you two were making about the literature review process. Just because it was interesting, I've actually, I've in a similar vein, Allison. I've been trying to be looking for that and cognizant of that, and it's fascinating and a little disheartening how infrequent it can be anyway. No acknowledgement of potential researcher bias, or no acknowledgement of researcher positionality. And I think that that's such an important thing that gets lost. I was reading an article the other day, and it was an otherwise well-written article, but I felt almost distrustful of it because there was no disclosure of that. There was they did some really nice analysis of a specific metric that I like to use called the MMPI, which it's dubious, but they've improved it a lot. All that to say that this research that I'm looking at, this is good stuff, but they don't mention a lot of those things that you need to take into account when you're using those sorts of scales. Like, hey, this scale may have a slight bias in this particular, and it just, it gutted that for me. But to kind of expand that to how I'm approaching my dissertation process, it's something that I've noticed, again, to broaden that, is lacking in a general fashion. That's, again, to use the same word, disheartening, because especially as what I'm starting to look at is specifically for my dissertation, looking at counselor education ethics, or ethics teaching is what I'm trying to say. So how counselor educators teach counseling students ethics. And there's this interesting theme in the field. There's a significant lack of literature, frankly, because that literature raises the uncomfortable tension that we've kind of talked about of, hey, if you really want to comport with the values of the counseling field, you got to have really frank discussions about how you can't be a racist counselor or a sexist counselor or a homophobic counselor or an anti-trans counselor, like all of these different things. But at the same time, there's this hesitancy to push back on those things because there's a fear among counselor educators that if we push back, we're going to get in trouble for not being, for trying to foist our values upon a student. But at a point, there comes that rub, like, you can't really allow somebody who holds these problematic values to be a counselor.
Right.
So all that to say, there's a lot of difficulty there. And so that's what I'm hoping to look at in my dissertation is, okay, I want to have some frank discussions about why, so it'd be semi-qualitative, looking at what do you wish you could say to your students is essentially what I want to get to, and why don't you say it? And so I'll be interested to see what that pans out, because I get the sense that there are a lot of counselor educators who do want to have those conversations, but they don't feel like they have the space to. And so we're going to be hopefully creating that situation. You know, my hope is that we'll be making that happen as we proceed with the dissertation process. You know, and I want it to just be a foundation piece. I don't want it to be a be all end all, but a springboard into, let's start having these conversations as a field, and within making sure that my research is equitable. I think it'll be completely, I would be remiss if I didn't include my own positionality as a researcher, my own input, my own ideas, my own, I hesitate to say political biases, but even political biases, right? Like, you know, I, I have, I have strong inclinations politically. I have strong inclinations in certain other areas. So making sure that those weave into my dissertation process as well. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. My master's at Ohio State University was on holistic education, and I specifically looked at teachers as holistic human beings and not just a vessel through which information was transmitted.
Right.
And that's exactly what you're saying, is that we expect professors, we expect leaders to be these non-biased, purveyors of information, when there are very real stakes here that that might require us to be, to actually have and voice opinions, especially when it comes to issues of equity. And then the question becomes, how do we do that in a way that doesn't alienate students with differing opinions, but invites that democratic participation and democratic discussion? And that's a whole other issue. But I think that they're all caught up in one another, right?
Yeah.
And I just really love this idea of looking at things holistically instead of bits and pieces that are fragmented and mechanized, because that's not how the world works. That's how we thought the world works, but it doesn't work like that. These are ecosystems, not machines.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
so just a little bit about my dissertation, because I know we're about at the end of our time. The really exciting thing is, for my dissertation, is that I wanted to measure impacts of certain programs. And this is not new or even exciting, right? Like, people measure impacts of programs all the time. And that's program evaluation, which is a field that I really love and I think is super, super important. So the methodology that I'm using is called SROI, which is social return on investment. And at its heart, SROI has social justice and equity, because it accounts not just for financial returns, but for social and environmental impacts as created by a business or a program. So it looks at the ripple effects created by a program or by a business, and then it takes in all of these aspects of impacts and then measures them using financial terms to result in a traditional ROI proportion at the end. For every dollar you invest, we create X amount of dollars in impact. But it has at its heart social justice and equity because of the way it's conducted. So SROI, social return on investment, the very first principle is involvement of stakeholders. So usually program evaluation, talks about like, oh, we intend to do X, Y, or Z, or we want to reach this many people, or, we're gonna do this many activities, and that's success. What SROI does is it goes to the stakeholders, or those primary beneficiaries, and it says, how did you change as a result of this program. What change did you experience? Or what did you experience differently as a result of this business activity? And then the rest of the measurement follows from the voice of the stakeholder. So it's not what the program implementers think should be the outcome. It's what the participants or the customer experiences as the actual change being made by the program. So the way that it achieves equity is multiple levels. First, it puts stakeholder voice to the front. Second, it encourages direct communication with those primary beneficiaries. And, for us in rural Ohio here, if we're implementing, we have even if we're the director of a nonprofit, most of us have direct contact with our clients. But in some of these very large organizations, they don't have contact with the clients, or, we can get into this like hamster wheel of program production, and we never really stop to ask, are we actually doing good?
Mhm.
Or are we just making sure that our numbers add up? So, and then we go into those communities and we say, what is the real impact being created for you? And then SROI allows us to put all of those impacts in one format, so we can say, oh, the most good is being done here. Let's do more of that. So, and the other thing that I really love about SROI is that it takes into account environmental impacts, which is an aspect of equity that we really haven't talked about, but I just wanted to make sure that we brought it up in our conclusion here, because, our non-human life forms can't necessarily participate in conversations the same way that we can, but we are absolutely interdependent on them. And so I think that any conversation of equity in the Anthropocene has to include non-human others and has to account for impact on the environment.
Absolutely.
So I don't really know what that looks like, but I think that SROI does a really good job of at least trying to take that reporting into account in any program impacts evaluation. So
yeah.
So
Well,
Brandon, I think that we have really, this has been a lengthy discussion. So you want to take us out here?
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to say thanks to you two, and I very much value the conversation we had. And I think it's important, and I think we all touched on this in different ways. It's important that we are addressing these factors in how we approach not just academia, and not just our research, but understanding that this impacts who we are as people, and that all of these things are connected. It's almost folly to try and think that we could discreetly have different boxes. Life doesn't work that way. Justice doesn't work that way. Equity doesn't work that way. It's all so much deeper. Identity doesn't work that way. So if we're not having these conversations, we're reinforcing problematic systems. And I hesitate to say that because I don't want to shift any blame onto anybody, but more of a acknowledging that these frank discussions about how we can make space for these important things is the way, like you said it earlier, Alice, and it's we're going to have to be the change that we want to see, essentially. And that's why this is important, making that space and making it intentionally, taking steps to understand ourselves and others in the holistic system in which we all exist. So that's kind of the fine point. I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to add to that.
Yeah, I think you did a great job, summarizing and concluding it. I just wanted to say I'm happy we had this conversation. I think it was very informative, and very helpful. Give us some things to think about, for the future as we interact with people, as we do our research and, academic work, and even, our daily interactions with people. So I'm very happy, to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, thanks to all of you, and good luck.
Yes.
The years
Yeah.
to come.
Hello, my name's Doug Bowie, and I'll be talking about the logic of inquiry as it relates to my path during research and working toward my, with my research. So I'll be covering some overview of the history, a little bit of the context and scope of the logic of inquiry, the role that standard bodies can play when we go to read research and think about research and work with research, and finally the impact on my research and how this sort of quest of discovery for the logic of inquiry has shaped that and changed that a little bit. So when I originally looked into the logic of inquiry, I began to just look at some readings and what did it say. And I eventually came across this quote by John Dewey, which is quite chewy. It really took some processing for me to sit down and think about what it meant and where it was going and that kind of thing. And as I moved along through that, I found other readings that sort of deconstructed that into larger pieces and smaller pieces and helped me to understand more of what the logic of inquiry was doing as we helped to set that up. And so some of that discussion about, how can we go about looking into things leads into a slightly larger discussion about research design, the types and kinds, how they fit together, how they sometimes contrast and compare, often looking at the same point of inquiry with different methods and different methodologies and different theories can lead to outcomes that are sometimes seemingly at odds with each other, but ultimately are trying to describe this same question. And the direction that we should be going with that becomes much more interesting as we move along. With multiple methods and methodologies, we have a larger context in which to look at a single question or even multiple questions. In Green's piece of article talks about triangulating theories to examine the contributions of each, and that contribution would be toward either a body of inquiry or a single point of inquiry. And that makes it very interesting because as we begin to look at those ideas of how can I compare and contrast different ways of looking at a problem and looking at a line of inquiry, it leads us down that road. And ultimately, we wind up with a series of ideas or methods and methodologies that let us look at that. And into that, we have to begin to inject this discussion of how do I report that? How do I talk about that? And standard bodies like the AERA provide a good framework for understanding how research can be evaluated. And there's no one standard on what must be in our reporting, but they give some strong guidance on what ought to be reported so that research can be evaluated. We're doing not an apples to apples comparison, but a just and reasonable comparison of what's being reported so that it can be considered both warranted. Is this research that needs to be done, and transparent? We can follow the line of inquiry as it goes from a question through its methods and methodologies to the conclusion. Do they make sense? Are they connected together? As I worked through these concepts and I looked at my research questions and I thought about the different methods and methodologies, I had been working my way toward a mixed methods discussion so that I could bring together both a quantitative and a qualitative aspect to the research that I want to do to form a metacognition. And that allows me to bring both of those together to answer a single question while using research and results from multiple methods and methodologies to help support that line of inquiry. And that ultimately drives my outline, the design elements that go into how do I lay this out so that it is transparent and the line of inquiry is maintained throughout the entire document so that I'm not making a leap of logic somewhere along the way that I can see or I believe I see and that others may or may not see. And if I haven't laid it out correctly, it won't flow the right way and it won't be good research, frankly. I want to say thank you for all the time and attention that you've paid. These are the researches and references and research that I did in making this recording. Research Roundtable would like to thank you for your time.